The service entrance smelled of lemon polish and something else I could not quite identify. Something cold and metallic that made the hair on my arms stand up despite the August heat. My reflection in the polished marble floor looked small and uncertain. A 26-year-old woman clutching a second-hand duffel bag like it might protect her from whatever waited beyond the pristine white walls. $5,000 a week. The number had repeated in my mind like a mantra during the entire bus ride from the city. During the long walk up the private drive after the security gate had buzzed me through, during every second of doubt that whispered I should turn around and run. But I could not run. Dylan needed me. My 14-year-old brother was 3 months into experimental leukemia treatment that insurance refused to cover, and the hospital bills had grown into a mountain I could not climb alone. Our parents had been dead for 3 years, killed by a drunk driver who walked away with barely a scratch while I became a legal guardian at 23 and watched my college dreams disappear into a fog of funeral arrangements and custody hearings. This job was a miracle. An exclusive agency had called me out of nowhere after I had applied to dozens of cleaning services, offering a live-in maid position that paid more than I had made in 6 months at my previous 3 jobs combined. The catch was simple. I would replace a maid who had left suddenly. I would live on the estate. I would be available at all hours, and I would sign a non-disclosure agreement thicker than my lease had ever been. The housekeeper who met me at the service entrance was exactly what I expected from a house like this. Mrs. Kovac was somewhere in her 60s with steel gray hair pulled into a bun so tight it looked painful, and eyes that assessed me like I was livestock at auction. She did not smile. She did not welcome me. She simply looked me up and down with an expression that suggested I had already failed some invisible test. "You follow the rules," she said in accented English that might have been Russian or Polish or something else entirely. "You keep your head down. You do not ask questions. Understand?" I nodded, swallowing hard against the sudden dryness in my throat. The words should have been a simple orientation, standard instructions for any domestic employee. Instead, they sounded like a warning, like a threat wrapped in the language of employment. But $5,000 a week. Dylan's treatment. The eviction notice I had barely avoided last month. I understood perfectly. I understood that I would follow whatever rules this house demanded, because I had no other choice. Mrs. Kovac turned without another word, and I followed her deeper into the estate, my footsteps echoing against marble that probably cost more than everything I had ever owned combined. My first morning in the estate felt like walking through a museum where everything was priceless and nothing was meant to be touched. Mrs. Kovac handed me a printed schedule that detailed every hour of my day with military precision, and at the bottom in bold letters were 3 rules that made my stomach clench. Never enter the East Wing. Never go to the 3rd floor after 10 p.m. Never open locked doors. I read them twice, waiting for her to elaborate, to explain why a maid would need such specific restrictions. She offered nothing but a stern look that said questions were not welcome here. The library was my first assignment. A cathedral of leather-bound books that stretched 2 stories high with one of those rolling ladders I had only seen in movies. I dusted carefully, hyper-aware of the cameras in every corner, their red lights blinking like watching eyes. Halfway through the 3rd shelf I found a book on Roman military strategy. Its spine cracked from frequent reading, and when I opened it to check for dust between the pages, I saw handwritten notes in the margins. The handwriting was bold and precise, commenting on battle tactics and territorial control with the kind of focus that suggested the reader was applying these ancient lessons to something current, something real. I closed the book quickly and returned it to its place, my hands suddenly shaking. This was just a wealthy businessman, I told myself. Rich people had eccentric interests. It meant nothing. But as I moved through the hallways with my cleaning cart, I kept noticing things that did not fit the narrative I was trying to construct. Men in expensive suits appeared and disappeared like ghosts, speaking in rapid Italian or Russian or languages I could not identify. They stopped talking the moment I rounded a corner, their eyes tracking me with the kind of assessment that made me feel like prey. Security cameras were everywhere, sophisticated models that swiveled to follow movement, and twice I saw men wearing earpieces stationed at strategic points throughout the house, their jackets cut in a way that suggested they were carrying weapons beneath the fine fabric. The house itself felt wrong, too quiet, too controlled. Like everyone who worked here was performing a carefully choreographed dance, and I had not yet learned the steps. I should have been afraid, should have recognized the red flags for what they were. But every time doubt crept in, I thought of Dylan in his hospital bed, his face gaunt from chemotherapy, his eyes still holding hope that I could fix this, that I could save him the way I had promised. $5,000 a week, $20,000 a month. Enough to keep him alive. Enough to justify ignoring the cameras and the armed men and the book about military conquest with fresh notes in the margins. I needed this job too badly to ask the questions that were piling up in my mind like unpaid bills. The main office was on my schedule for 4 p.m., and I approached it with the same careful attention I had given every other room that day, knocking twice before entering as Mrs. Kovac had instructed. The door was already open and I could hear a voice inside speaking rapid Italian, the words flowing with the kind of authority that made even a language I did not understand sound like commands. I hesitated in the doorway, cleaning supplies in hand, wondering if I should come back later. But the schedule had been specific, 4 p.m., main office. So I stepped inside and finally saw the man who owned this strange, gilded prison. He was a strikingly handsome man in his late 20s, standing by the floor-to-ceiling windows with a phone pressed to his ear, and the late afternoon sun turned him into a silhouette of sharp angles and coiled power. Dark hair cut precisely, shoulders broad beneath a charcoal suit that probably cost more than my entire wardrobe had ever been worth. And even from across the room, I could feel the weight of his presence like a physical thing pressing against my chest. He glanced at me and gestured with his free hand to continue, a casual wave that somehow felt like a command from a king granting permission to a servant. I moved into the room on legs that felt suddenly unstable, hyper-aware of every sound I made as I began dusting the bookshelves that lined one wall. His voice continued in Italian, the words punctuated by long pauses where I assumed someone on the other end was speaking, and I tried to focus on my work instead of the man who dominated the space like a storm about to break. But I could feel his eyes on me, could sense him studying me even as he continued his conversation. The desk between us was massive and made of dark wood that gleamed like water, its surface spotless except for a single manila folder placed with geometric precision in the center. Everything about him and his space spoke of control, of power so absolute it did not need to announce itself. When he finally ended the call, the silence that followed felt thick enough to choke on. "You are the new girl," he said, and his voice was different than I expected, smooth and low with an accent that was slight but present, wrapping around the English words like silk around steel. "Maya, is it not?" It was not really a question. I turned to face him, my duster clutched in suddenly sweaty hands. "Yes, sir," I managed, my voice steadier than I felt. He moved closer, circling his desk with the fluid grace of a predator, and I got my first clear look at his face. Eyes like black ice, sharp cheekbones, a mouth that curved in something that was not quite a smile. He was beautiful in the way dangerous things are beautiful, the way a blade catches light before it cuts. "Mrs. Kovac says you need this position badly," he continued, stopping a few feet away, close enough that I could smell his cologne, something expensive and subtle, with notes of cedar and smoke. "That is good. Desperation breeds loyalty." The words should have offended me, should have made me angry. Instead, they made me afraid because they were true, and we both knew it. The second floor. Hallway was identical to a dozen other hallways in this maze of a house, all pristine white walls and numbered doors that looked exactly the same from the outside. I had been cleaning for hours, my shoulders aching from reaching and scrubbing, when I realized I had left my caddy of supplies in the last room. Exhaustion made me careless. I retraced my steps, counting doors, certain I had been in the third one on the left. The door was unlocked, which should have been my first warning, and I pushed it open, already reaching for my caddy before my brain caught up with what my eyes were seeing. The room was nothing like the elegant bedrooms and sitting rooms I had been cleaning all day. This was concrete and harsh overhead lighting and a drain in the center of the floor like something from a butcher shop or a nightmare. 3 men were bound to chairs in various states of consciousness, their faces swollen and bloodied, and standing over them in shirt sleeves rolled to his elbows was the strikingly handsome man in his late 20s who signed my paychecks, a gun held loosely in his right hand like it was an extension of his body. 2 other men flanked him, both built like walls, both watching the bound men with the detached interest of people who had seen this before and would see it again. The smell hit me next, copper and sweat and something else, something primal that my hindbrain recognized as terror. My cleaning caddy slipped from my numb fingers and hit the concrete floor with a clatter that sounded like thunder in the terrible silence. Every head turned toward me, every eye locked onto my face. I could not breathe, could not move, could not process what I was seeing, even as my mind screamed at me to run. But my legs had turned to water, and my hand was still on the doorknob, and for one suspended moment, I thought maybe I could back out slowly, close the door, pretend I had seen nothing. "Close the door, Maya," he said without turning back to look at me, his voice as calm as if he were discussing the weather. From the inside, the words cut through my paralysis like a blade. He knew my name, had known I was there before I made a sound. And he was not surprised or angry or concerned. He was simply giving me an instruction, and something in the absolute authority of his tone made my body obey before my mind could catch up. I stepped into the room and pushed the door closed behind me, the click of the latch as final as a death sentence. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead. One of the bound men was crying quietly, blood running from his nose into his mouth. The gun in Dante's hand caught the light as he finally turned to look at me, and his eyes were as cold and empty as a winter sky. I had made a terrible mistake. I had seen too much, and the look on his face told me that everything was about to change. He moved toward me slowly, each step deliberate and measured, like he had all the time in the world, and my back hit the door so hard I felt the impact in my spine. My hands were shaking uncontrollably, my breath coming in short gasps that made my vision blur at the edges. And somewhere in the rational part of my brain that was still functioning, I recognized I was hyperventilating. "I did not see anything," I heard myself say, the words tumbling out in a desperate rush. "I swear I did not see anything. I will leave right now. I will forget I was ever here. I will never say a word to anyone. Please." He stopped a few feet away, close enough that I could see the small spatter of blood on his collar, far enough that he was not crowding me even though we both knew I had nowhere to go. His expression was eerily calm, almost curious, like I was a puzzle he was working out in real time. "Will you?" he asked, his voice still carrying that same unsettling steadiness. "Or will you run straight to the police and tell them exactly what you saw in this room?" His hand reached past my shoulder and I flinched, expecting violence, but he simply turned the lock on the door with a soft click that sounded impossibly loud. "Sit down," he said, gesturing to a metal chair against the wall that I had not noticed before. "We need to talk." I could not move, could not think past the terror that had locked my muscles in place. Behind him, one of the guards said something in Italian, and he responded without looking away from me. And whatever he said made both guards grab the bound men and drag them toward a door I had not seen, a door that probably led somewhere worse than this concrete room. When they were gone and it was just the two of us and the smell of blood and fear, he said it again. Sit. My legs gave out, and I half collapsed into the chair, my whole body trembling so hard my teeth chattered. He pulled another chair over and sat facing me, close enough that our knees almost touched, and this close I could see that he was not angry or threatening. He looked almost patient, like a teacher waiting for a slow student to catch up. "Those men stole from me," he said in that same calm tone. "They worked for me for 3 years and they betrayed me. They sold information to my competitors that could have gotten good people killed. This is my business, Maya. This is what I do." I stared at him, at this strikingly handsome man in his late 20s who was explaining torture and murder like it was a quarterly earnings report, and something inside me shattered. I had walked into the wrong room and seen too much, and now I was sitting here, listening to a criminal justify violence, and I knew with bone-deep certainty that my life as I had known it was over. He let me go eventually, after what felt like hours, but was probably only 30 minutes of him explaining his business in that same terrifyingly calm voice, while I sat frozen in the metal chair trying not to vomit. When he finally stood and unlocked the door and told me I could leave, I ran. Not walked. Ran through the pristine hallways to the servants' quarters where my small room waited, with its narrow bed and single window, and the moment the door closed behind me, I collapsed against it and let the tears come. My hands shook so violently I could barely grip my suitcase when I pulled it from under the bed, could barely fold my few possessions into it with any kind of order. I had been here less than 12 hours. 12 hours and I had already witnessed something that could get me killed. I was furious at myself for taking this job, for being so desperate that I had ignored every red flag, for thinking that $5,000 a week was anything other than blood money. I scrawled a resignation note on the back of my schedule, my handwriting barely legible through the shaking. I quit effective immediately. Thank you for the opportunity. I did not sign it. What was the point? By 11 p.m. I was creeping through the dark mansion toward the service entrance, my suitcase clutched in one sweating hand, my heart hammering so hard I thought it might crack my ribs. The house felt different at night, less like a museum and more like a mausoleum, all shadows and echoes and the distant hum of security systems. Every camera I passed felt like an accusation. Every dark corner might hide one of his men. I kept my head down and moved as quietly as possible, rehearsing what I would tell Dylan when I got back to the city. "I will find another job," I whispered to myself like a prayer. "Any job, fast food, retail, cleaning offices at night, anything that does not involve witnessing torture. Anything that lets me sleep without seeing those men bound to chairs and that gun in his hand and his eyes so cold and empty when he looked at me." Dylan would understand. He had to understand. I could not stay here. Could not work for a man who did those things as casually as other people filed paperwork. Could not spend another night under this roof knowing what happened in rooms I was not supposed to enter. The service entrance was just ahead, that plain white door that led to the outside world and safety and a life that made sense. My hand was reaching for the handle when I saw him, leaning against the wall beside the door like he had been waiting for me. Like he had known exactly what I would do and when I would do it. The strikingly handsome man in his late 20s who owned this house and everything in it, still in his blood-stained shirt sleeves, watching me with those black ice eyes that saw everything. My suitcase hit the floor with a sound like a gunshot in the quiet hallway, and I gasped, my hand flying to my mouth as if I could somehow take back the noise. He did not move, just stood there leaning against the service door with his arms crossed over his chest, still in those shirt sleeves with the blood dried dark on the white fabric, looking for all the world like he had been waiting for me and had all the patience in the universe to continue waiting. The emergency exit light above the door cast everything in a red glow that made the scene feel like something from a nightmare, and maybe it was. Maybe I was still in my narrow bed dreaming this whole impossible day. Going somewhere, he asked, and there was something almost amused in his tone, like he found my escape attempt entertaining rather than insulting. I quit, I managed to say, my voice high and thin with panic. You cannot keep me here. I am leaving right now and you cannot stop me. He pushed off the door in one fluid movement, unfolding his arms and moving toward me with that same predatory grace I had noticed in his office. And every instinct I had screamed at me to run, but there was nowhere to go. He was between me and the only exit, and the hallway stretched behind me into darkness and locked doors. You are not going anywhere, he said, and his voice was soft but carried the weight of absolute authority, the kind of certainty that made argument feel impossible. Not until we have reached an understanding. The words hit me like a physical blow, not a request, not a negotiation. A simple statement of fact, delivered by a strikingly handsome man in his late 20s who was used to being obeyed without question. I backed up a step, and then another, but he kept coming. Not rushing, not threatening, just advancing with the inevitability of a tide coming in. You cannot keep me prisoner, I said, hating how my voice shook. This is kidnapping. This is illegal. I will go to the police. I will tell them everything I saw. He stopped then, close enough that I could see the flecks of gold in his dark eyes, close enough that I could smell the copper tang of blood mixed with his expensive cologne. And that is exactly why you are not leaving, he said. You are a witness now, Maya. You saw something you were never meant to see. That makes you valuable. That makes you dangerous. That makes you mine until I decide otherwise. The red emergency light painted half his face in shadow and the other half in crimson, and in that moment, he looked like the devil himself come to collect a debt I did not know I owed. My legs gave out and I sank against the wall, my suitcase forgotten on the floor between us, and I understood with perfect terrible clarity that everything had changed and there was no going back. His hand barely touched my elbow, but I felt the pressure of it like a brand as he guided me away from the service door and back through the dark hallways toward his office, and the gentleness of the gesture was somehow more terrifying than if he had dragged me. He was not forcing me. He was simply directing me where he wanted me to go, and we both knew I would follow because what choice did I have? The office looked different at night, with only a few lamps burning, and the city lights beyond the floor-to-ceiling windows creating a backdrop of distant stars, and he gestured to one of the leather chairs across from his desk before moving to a bar cart in the corner. Drink, he asked, already reaching for a crystal decanter filled with amber liquid. I shook my head, not trusting my voice, and he poured himself a generous measure into a heavy glass, before returning to lean against his desk rather than sit behind it, close enough that I had to tilt my head back to meet his eyes. He sipped his whiskey and studied me with that same patient intensity, like he had all night to wait for me to stop shaking, to start thinking clearly. You have two choices, he said finally, his voice carrying the reasonable tone of a professor explaining a difficult concept to a struggling student. You can work for me, properly compensated and protected, continuing the job you were hired to do with some additional considerations for your safety. Or, he let the word hang in the air between us, took another sip of his drink, waited. Or you kill me, I finished, surprised by the steadiness in my voice, surprised I could speak at all past the terror lodged in my throat. Something flickered in his eyes, not quite amusement but close. I do not kill innocent people, Maya, he said. You walked into the wrong room. You saw something you should not have seen, but that was my failure, not yours. You did nothing wrong. My enemies, however, he continued, swirling the whiskey in his glass, they would very much like to find someone who witnessed what you witnessed tonight. Someone who could testify about my methods, my business, my organization, someone they could use as leverage against me. The moment you walked into that room, you became valuable. Not to me originally, but to anyone who wants to hurt me. I stared at him, my mind racing to catch up with what he was saying. You are saying I am in danger because I saw you. Because I am a witness. Now you understand, he said with what might have been approval. I cannot let you leave because the moment you walk out that door, you become a target. My competitors will find you within hours. They have people everywhere. They will take you, and they will hurt you until you tell them everything, and then they will hurt you more to send me a message. His words painted a picture I did not want to see, but could not look away from. And beneath my terror, I felt something else rising. Anger. Hot and bright and clarifying. So I am a prisoner either way, I said. Either here with you, or out there with your enemies. He set his whiskey down and reached across the desk to pull a manila folder toward him. The same folder I had seen that afternoon when I first entered this office, and when he slid it across the polished wood toward me, I knew with sinking certainty that whatever was inside would change everything. I opened it with trembling hands and felt the world tilt sideways. My entire life was documented in those pages with a thoroughness that made my skin crawl. Medical bills from St. Mary's Hospital with Dylan's name at the top, itemized charges for experimental leukemia treatments that our insurance had denied, a running total that had climbed to $180,000, the eviction notice from months ago that I had barely avoided by borrowing money I could not pay back. My parents' accident report complete with photos of the wreckage that I had never wanted to see. My college transcripts showing the semester I had dropped out. Bank statements revealing exactly how close to financial collapse I was living every single day. Even a copy of my application to the cleaning agency with my desperate cover letter about needing steady work to support my family. You investigated me, I said, and it was not a question because the evidence was literally in my hands, proof that this strikingly handsome man in his late 20s had violated every aspect of my privacy before I had even set foot in his house. I investigate everyone in my home, he said simply, without a trace of apology in his voice. Your brother Dylan is 14 years old, receiving treatment at St. Mary's under Dr. Patricia Chen, who is not related to you despite the shared last name. Experimental therapy, not covered by insurance. $180,000 still owed, and the hospital will stop treatment in 6 weeks if you cannot make significant payment. He paused, picked up his whiskey, took a slow sip while I sat there drowning in the horror of how much he knew. I can make that disappear, he said. The words hung in the air between us like a lifeline thrown to a drowning woman, and I hated myself for how desperately I wanted to grab it. The office felt smaller now, the walls closing in as exhaustion from this impossible day finally caught up with me. My hands were still shaking as I closed the folder, but for a different reason now. He was not just threatening me. He was offering to solve the problem that had been crushing me for months, the weight that woke me at 3 a.m. in a cold sweat, wondering how I would keep my brother alive. $180,000. Gone. Just like that. And all it would cost me was my freedom, my safety, my soul. All it would cost me was staying in this beautiful prison with a man who tortured people in windowless rooms and somehow made it sound reasonable when he explained why. 2 weeks, I heard myself say, the words tasting like ash in my mouth. I will stay for 2 weeks, while you handle whatever situation you need to handle with your enemies. Then I leave, and you let me go. He tilted his head slightly, considering, and I rushed on before he could refuse. And you pay Dylan's medical bills. All of them. Immediately. Not as a promise. Not as something you will do later. Right now. Tonight. He set down his whiskey and pulled out his phone, typed something with his thumbs while I watched in disbelief, and less than a minute later my own phone buzzed in my pocket with a notification from the hospital billing department. Payment received in full for patient Dylan Chen. My vision blurred with tears I refused to let fall. $180,000 transferred like it was nothing, like it was pocket change. To this strikingly handsome man in his late 20s, who tortured people and bought loyalty with the same casual efficiency. "You will stay in the main house," he said, pocketing his phone. "Not the servants' quarters. You are under my direct protection now, which means you go nowhere without my approval. You do not leave the property. You do not contact anyone without my knowledge. You do not discuss what you saw tonight or anything else you might see during your time here." His eyes held mine with that same intensity that made me feel like he could see straight through to my bones. "Do we have an agreement?" It was not really a question, but I nodded anyway, sealing whatever bargain I was making with the devil. He extended his hand across the desk, a bizarrely formal gesture given the circumstances, and I stared at it for a long moment before reaching out to take it. His grip was warm and firm and mercifully brief, his palm slightly rough with calluses I had not expected on a man who wore suits that cost more than cars. The handshake felt like signing a contract I had not been allowed to read, accepting terms I did not fully understand, selling my soul for my brother's life. He seemed satisfied but not gloating as he released my hand. No triumph in his expression, just a kind of calm certainty, like he had known all along that I would agree, because what choice did I really have? I felt hollow as I stood to leave, empty of everything except the knowledge that Dylan would live, and I had just accepted the terms of a gilded cage. My suitcase was still in the hallway by the service door, but I did not go back for it. What was the point? I was not going anywhere. Not for 2 weeks at least. Maybe not ever, depending on how this strikingly handsome man in his late 20s decided to define protection, and how long his enemies remained a threat, and whether he would actually keep his word to let me go when this was over. I woke to sunlight streaming through floor-to-ceiling windows, and for one blissful moment I forgot where I was, forgot everything that had happened the night before, forgot the blood and the gun and the handshake that had sealed my fate. Then reality crashed back in, and I sat up so fast my head spun, taking in the room that was nothing like the narrow servants' quarters where I had unpacked my suitcase yesterday morning. This was luxury on a scale I had only seen in magazines, all white linens and gold accents and furniture that looked like it belonged in a palace. A private balcony overlooked manicured gardens that stretched toward distant trees, and everything was so pristine and perfect it felt like a movie set, like I was an actress playing the role of someone who belonged in a space like this. I stumbled to the closet hoping to find my own clothes, my worn jeans and clearance rack shirts that would remind me who I actually was. But instead, I found an entire wardrobe of designer pieces still bearing tags with prices that made my stomach clench. Someone had measured me, guessed my size perfectly, and filled this closet with clothes I could never afford in 3 lifetimes. I felt like I was playing dress-up in someone else's life as I pulled on jeans that fit like they had been tailored for my body and a cashmere sweater in deep emerald that was softer than anything I had ever touched. And when I caught my reflection in the full-length mirror, I barely recognized myself. I looked expensive. I looked like I belonged here. The thought made me want to tear the clothes off and demand my own back, except I had no idea where my suitcase had ended up, or if I even had the right to ask for it anymore. A knock at the door made me jump, and Mrs. Kovac entered without waiting for permission, carrying a tray laden with breakfast that smelled like heaven and looked like something from a 5-star hotel. She set it on a small table near the windows, and I noticed her expression was different than yesterday, less stern and more uncertain, like my presence had disrupted some fundamental order of the household. "You are not to clean anymore," she said, the words seeming to cost her some effort. "Mr. Moretti's orders. You are a guest now." The word guest sounded strange in her heavily accented voice, like she was trying out a foreign concept and finding it did not quite fit. I stared at the breakfast tray with its silver covers and fresh flowers, at the cashmere sweater that probably cost more than my monthly rent used to be, at the gilded cage that was now my reality. I was not a maid anymore, but I was not exactly a guest either. I was something else entirely, something I did not have a name for yet. Mrs. Kovac had barely left when my phone buzzed with a text from an unknown number telling me to come to his office immediately, and the casual assumption that I would obey without question made anger flare hot in my chest, even as I found myself walking down the hallway toward the room where this had all begun. He was behind his desk this time, back in a fresh suit, with no trace of blood, looking every inch the successful businessman, except for the hardness in his eyes that no amount of expensive tailoring could disguise. "Sit," he said, and I remained standing out of pure spite, even though my legs were shaking. He did not react to my small rebellion, just steepled his fingers and began speaking in that same calm professorial tone. "The rules are simple. You do not leave this property under any circumstances. You do not contact anyone without my explicit approval. You do not discuss what you saw last night or anything else you might witness while you are here. You do not ask questions about my business, and you do not go anywhere I have not cleared first." "This is kidnapping," I said, my voice sharper than I felt. "You are holding me here against my will. That is illegal." "This is protection," he corrected, and there was something harder in his voice now, something that made me take an involuntary step back. "There is a difference." He opened a folder on his desk and turned it toward me, and I saw crime scene photos that made bile rise in my throat. The three men from last night, or what was left of them, photographed in various locations around the city. "My competitors know someone witnessed their interrogation," he continued as I stared at the images in horror. "They know I had a witness in that room, and they want that witness. They found these men within hours of their release and made examples of them. Imagine what they would do to you." The photos swam in my vision, and I gripped the edge of his desk to keep from falling. "But I need to contact my brother," I managed. "He will worry. He will try to find me. I will approve and monitor any communication with your brother," Dante said, not unkindly. "You can tell him you have taken a new position that requires you to live on site with limited phone access. You cannot tell him where you are or what you have seen." The strikingly handsome man in his late 20s, who held my life in his hands, looked at me with something that might have been sympathy if I did not know what he was capable of. "This is not a punishment, Maya. This is survival. Mine, and now yours." 3 days passed in a strange limbo where I existed in luxury I had never imagined while feeling like a prisoner in a palace, and the worst part was how often I crossed paths with the strikingly handsome man in his late 20s who owned both the palace and apparently my life. He worked from home, which meant I could not avoid him no matter how hard I tried. Breakfast became an unexpected routine where Mrs. Kovac set two places at the small table in the sunroom, and he appeared like clockwork at 8, wearing suits that probably cost more than I used to make in a year, reading his phone while I picked at food I could not taste. He never tried to force conversation, but his presence was unavoidable, filling the space until I felt like I could not breathe properly. I spent hours in the library trying to lose myself in books, and of course he found me there on the second day, settling into a chair across from mine, with his laptop, like it was the most natural thing in the world for a captor and captive to share reading space. "You like Russian literature?" he asked without looking up from his screen, and I realized he had been watching me select books from the shelves. I did not look up from my page. "I like stories about prisoners," I said, letting the words carry all my resentment. I felt more than saw his almost smile, that slight curve of his mouth that suggested I had amused him rather than insulted him. "Touché," he murmured, and went back to his work. The garden became my refuge until I realized he walked there too, usually in the early evening when the sun turned everything golden and the heat of the day had faded. We did not speak during these encounters, but I was hyper-aware of his presence, the way he moved through the space with complete ownership, stopping to examine plants or make calls in Italian that I could not understand. Sometimes his men appeared to speak with him, and he would gesture for me to continue walking, like he was giving me privacy, even though we both knew I was being watched every second. I was restless and hostile, pacing my gilded cage like a zoo animal. And he was patient in a way that made me angrier because I wanted him to be a monster, and instead he was just there, constant and unavoidable, drinking coffee in the morning and whiskey at night, working at his desk or reading in the library or walking the gardens like this was normal, like holding someone prisoner in luxury made it somehow acceptable. By the third day, I had memorized his routines without meaning to, knew when he took calls in his office, and when he disappeared to the East Wing, I was not allowed to enter, knew the exact moment he would appear for breakfast, and the way he took his coffee black with no sugar. I hated that I knew these things, hated how the house had started to feel familiar, hated the moments when I forgot to be afraid and just existed in his orbit like this was my life now. On the evening of the third day, Dante knocked on my door holding a tablet and told me I could call my brother, his voice carefully neutral as he explained that the call would be monitored and I should remember what we had discussed about what I could and could not say. My hands shook as I took the tablet and he withdrew to the doorway, close enough to hear everything, but far enough to give the illusion of privacy, and when Dylan's face appeared on the screen, I had to bite my lip to keep from crying. He looked better than he had in months, color in his cheeks that had been gray with illness, his eyes bright with an excitement I had not seen since before our parents died. "Maya," he said, his voice cracking with barely contained joy. "You are not going to believe what happened. The hospital called and said all my bills were paid. Every single one. An anonymous donor just transferred the entire amount and Dr. Chen says I can continue treatment without any interruptions. Can you believe it?" I forced a smile that felt like it might crack my face. "That is amazing, Dylan. I am so happy for you." He launched into details about his latest treatment session and how the experimental therapy was actually working, and how the nurses were saying he might be in remission within 6 months. And I made the appropriate sounds while dying inside because this joy, this hope, this life he was getting back was bought with my freedom. I told him about my new job, the carefully constructed lie about a live-in position with a wealthy family that required me to be on site with limited communication, and he accepted it easily because why would he question good news when he had just received the best news of his life? The call lasted 20 minutes, and by the end my face hurt from smiling, and my throat was raw from holding back tears. When Dylan's face disappeared from the screen, I sat there staring at the blank tablet, everything I had been holding inside for 3 days, finally breaking free. I cried like I had not cried since our parents' funeral, great heaving sobs that came from somewhere deep in my chest, grief and relief and rage all tangled together until I could not tell which emotion was which. I was grateful. I hated being grateful. Dylan was going to live, and that was worth anything, worth everything, but the cost was my life, and my freedom, and my soul. Through my tears, I became aware of a presence in the doorway and looked up to see Dante standing there, his expression unreadable as he watched me fall apart. For one terrible moment, I thought he would say something, would offer hollow comfort, or worse, would gloat about how thoroughly he owned me now. Instead, he simply looked at me for a long moment, something passing through his eyes that might have been understanding or regret. And then he turned and walked away without a word, closing the door softly behind him and leaving me alone with my grief. Sleep would not come, no matter how many times I closed my eyes and tried to force my mind into darkness. So at 2 a.m, I gave up and padded barefoot down the hallway toward the kitchen, thinking tea might help where willpower had failed. The house was different at night, less oppressive somehow, the shadows softer without the harsh sunlight that made everything feel like a stage set. I did not expect to find him there, this strikingly handsome man in his late 20s who usually seemed so controlled and untouchable. But when I pushed open the kitchen door, I saw him sitting at the counter in the dark with a glass of scotch, still wearing his dress shirt from earlier, but with the sleeves rolled up and the collar unbuttoned, looking more human than I had ever seen him. He glanced up when I entered but did not speak, did not order me to leave or ask what I was doing, just watched me move to the kettle with eyes that looked tired in a way that surprised me. I made my tea in silence, hyper aware of his presence. And when I turned to leave, he gestured to the stool beside him in what might have been an invitation or might have been a command, and I found myself sitting down because the alternative was fleeing like a frightened child. We sat there in the moonlight that streamed through the windows, not speaking, just existing in the same space without the usual tension crackling between us, and I realized this was the first time we had been alone together, where he was not interrogating me, or laying down rules, or watching me with that calculating intensity. "Do you ever regret it?" I asked, the question escaping before I could stop it. "The life you chose." He was silent for so long I thought he would not answer, just took a slow sip of his scotch and stared at something I could not see. "I did not choose it," he said finally, his voice different in the darkness, softer somehow, lacking the usual authority. "It chose me." He did not elaborate and I did not push, but something in the way he said those 5 words made me see him differently, made me wonder what circumstances had forged this man who tortured people in concrete rooms and paid medical bills for the sister of a woman he was holding prisoner. The kitchen felt smaller in the darkness, more intimate, like we had accidentally stumbled into a space outside the usual rules where captor and captive did not exist, and we were just 2 people who could not sleep, sitting in silence because sometimes silence was easier than the truth. Breakfast the next morning felt different. The air between us changed by whatever had happened in the dark kitchen at 2 a.m., and when he gestured to the chair across from him, I sat without the usual resistance, because something had shifted and I was too tired to fight it. He ate methodically, the way he seemed to do everything, precise and controlled, but there was a heaviness to him that I had not noticed before, or maybe had not wanted to see. "My father was murdered when I was 19, he said suddenly, not looking at me, his eyes fixed on his coffee cup like it held answers to questions he had stopped asking. The words fell between us like stones into still water, and I froze with my fork halfway to my mouth, not breathing, afraid that any movement might stop him from continuing. He had built an empire from nothing, came to this country with no money and no connections, and made himself into someone people feared and respected, and when they killed him, they thought they were destroying everything he had created. Dante looked up then, and his eyes were dark with something that might have been old grief or old rage, or both tangled together until they were inseparable. But they did not account for me. They thought I was just a boy, too young and too soft to take his place. They were wrong. I wanted to ask who killed him, wanted to ask if Dante had gotten revenge, but the look on the face of this strikingly handsome man in his late 20s who had inherited violence like other people inherited furniture stopped the questions in my throat. "My father gave me 2 choices before he died," he continued, his voice matter-of-fact now, but I could hear the pain underneath like a bass note vibrating below the melody. "Take his place, or watch everything he built destroy our family from the inside. His enemies would have come for my mother, my sister, everyone we loved. Some inheritances cannot be refused." The parallel to my own situation hit me like a physical blow, and I wondered if he had planned it that way, if this was manipulation disguised as vulnerability. But something in his expression told me he was not playing games right now, was not calculating his next move. He was just tired. Tired of carrying the weight of an empire he had never wanted but could not put down. "I did not choose this life, Maya," he said, using my name like he was trying to make me understand something important. I was 19 years old and my father was dead, and suddenly I was responsible for hundreds of people whose lives depended on the choices I made. You think you know what it means to sacrifice for family, but you were 23 when your parents died. I was still a teenager. I stared at him across the breakfast table in the morning sunlight, and for the first time since I had walked into that wrong room, I saw him not as my captor, but as another person trapped by circumstances beyond his control. and the realization terrified me more than any threat he could have made. That afternoon he found me in the garden, sitting on a stone bench near the fountain, where the sound of water made it easier to think, or maybe just easier to not think. And when he sat down beside me without asking permission, I tensed, waiting for more rules or revelations I was not ready to hear. "Tell me about your parents," he said, and the question was so unexpected that my first instinct was to refuse, to tell him he had no right to my grief after taking everything else. But something about his vulnerability at breakfast, the way he had let me see the weight he carried, made the defensive words die in my throat. "It was a drunk driver," I heard myself say, the words coming out flat and emotionless, because that was the only way I could say them without breaking. 3 in the afternoon on a Tuesday. He ran a red light going 60 in a 35 zone and hit them broadside. They were on their way to pick Dylan up from middle school. The fountain burbled beside us, and somewhere a bird sang, and the afternoon sun was warm on my face, and none of it matched the memory I was describing. The hospital with its fluorescent lights and antiseptic smell, and the way time had stretched and compressed until I could not tell if I had been there for hours or days. "I stayed with them," I continued, my voice starting to crack now, despite my efforts to keep it steady. "The doctors said it was just a matter of time, but I could not leave them. Dylan was there too, this 11-year-old kid who did not understand why his parents would not wake up. And I kept telling him it would be okay, even though I knew it would not be. I fell asleep in the chair between their beds, and when I woke up, they were both gone. I had missed it, missed their last moments, because I could not keep my eyes open. The tears came then, whether I wanted them or not, and I wiped them away angrily, hating that I was crying in front of this strikingly handsome man in his late 20s, who had probably never cried in his life. Dylan was only 11, I said. I was 23 in college, studying to be a social worker because I wanted to help people. I dropped out to raise him, and I would do it again. I would do it 1,000 times. He was quiet for a long moment, and when he finally spoke, his voice was softer than I had ever heard it. "That is what family means," he said. "Sacrifice without resentment." The words settled over me like a blanket, and I realized he understood in a way most people never could, understood the weight of responsibility accepted too young, and the impossibility of regretting choices that saved the people you loved, even when those choices destroyed the life you had planned. The explosion ripped through the night like the world was ending, the sound so loud it felt like my bones were rattling inside my skin, and I was thrown from my bed onto the floor as the windows shattered inward in a shower of glass that glittered like diamonds in the moonlight. My ears rang, and my mind could not process what was happening, could not understand why the floor was shaking, or why I could hear gunfire in the distance, getting closer by the second. And then my door burst open and he was there. Dante filled the doorway with a gun in his hand that looked like an extension of his body, his expression transformed into something cold and lethal that made him look nothing like the strikingly handsome man in his late 20s who had sat with me at breakfast talking about his murdered father. He was across the room in 3 strides, hauling me to my feet with one hand, while the other kept the gun trained on the hallway behind him. "Stay low," he commanded, his voice clipped and controlled even as another explosion somewhere closer made the walls shake. We moved through the house at a run, him half dragging me while men in suits raced past us toward the sound of gunfire, all of them armed and moving with the precision of people who had trained for exactly this scenario. I could hear shouting in multiple languages and the crack of weapons being fired and somewhere glass breaking in cascading waves, and my mind kept screaming that this was not real, could not be real. Except the hand gripping my arm was very real, and the gun he carried was very real, and the blood on the marble floor we ran past was sickeningly real. His office looked untouched by whatever chaos was consuming the rest of the house, and he pulled me toward a bookshelf that swung open at his touch, to reveal a concrete room lined with monitors showing security feeds from every angle of the estate. The screens displayed armed men in tactical gear breaching the perimeter, while his own men engaged them in a firefight that looked like something from a war zone. muzzle flashes lighting up the darkness like deadly fireflies. "Stay here," he said, pushing me toward the back of the small space. "Do not open this door for anyone but me. Do you understand?" I grabbed his arm before he could turn away, and the words came out without permission. "Do not get killed protecting me." Something flashed in his dark eyes, surprise maybe, or something warmer that I did not have time to identify. "I do not intend to," he said. And then he was gone, the door swinging shut behind him with a hydraulic hiss that sealed me inside with only the monitors for company, watching him disappear down the hallway toward the sound of gunfire, while my heart tried to beat its way out of my chest. Hours crawled by in that concrete tomb while I watched the monitors show violence. I had only seen in movies, men falling and not getting back up, fire consuming part of the garden, the security perimeter holding, and then not holding, and then somehow holding again. And through it all, I kept searching the screens for him, for that strikingly handsome man in his late 20s, who had sealed me in here and disappeared into the chaos. When the door finally hissed open, I spun around with my heart in my throat, not knowing if it would be him or someone else, someone who wanted the witness badly enough to breach an estate protected by 200 armed men. But it was him. His shirt was torn at the shoulder and splattered with blood. His face had a smear of crimson across his cheek that made him look like something from a nightmare. But he was alive and moving, and the relief that flooded through me was so powerful, it made my knees weak. He crossed to me immediately, hands moving over my shoulders and arms with clinical efficiency, checking for injuries with the same focused intensity he brought to everything. "Are you hurt?" he asked, his voice still carrying that clipped edge of command. "Did any of them get past the perimeter?" I shook my head, unable to form words, and then my hand was moving without permission, reaching up to touch his face, where the blood was drying dark against his skin. "You are hurt," I said, and my voice sounded strange to my own ears. He caught my hand before I could pull away, his fingers circling my wrist with surprising gentleness, given the violence he had just committed. The violence still evident in the tension of his body, and the adrenaline I could see burning in his eyes. "Not my blood," he said, and we both went very still. His thumb moved against the inside of my wrist where my pulse was hammering, and I could feel his heartbeat through his fingers, fast and strong and alive. The air between us changed, became charged with something I did not want to name, something that had been building since that first breakfast, and the midnight kitchen encounter, and the garden conversation about sacrifice. I should have pulled away. Should have stepped back and restored the distance that was supposed to exist between captor and captive. Instead, I stayed frozen with his hand around my wrist, and my palm still hovering near his blood-stained face, close enough that I could feel the heat radiating from his skin. His eyes held mine, and I saw something in them I had not seen before, something raw and unguarded that the violence had stripped bare, and I realized with sudden terrifying clarity that the walls we had both been maintaining were crumbling and neither of us was doing anything to stop it. He should have stepped back and I should have pulled my hand away, and we should have restored the boundaries that made this situation survivable. But neither of us moved, and the space between us kept shrinking until it was not space at all, but just breath and heat and the sound of my heart pounding so loud I was sure he could hear it. His free hand came up to cup my face, thumb tracing my cheekbone with a gentleness that contradicted everything I knew about what those hands could do, and when his gaze dropped to my mouth, I stopped breathing entirely. The kiss when it came was nothing like I expected, not calculated or controlled, but desperate and claiming and so real it made everything else fall away. The concrete room and the glowing monitors and the violence still smoldering outside. His mouth moved against mine with a hunger that matched something I had not known was living inside me. All the tension of the past week combusting into something I could not name and did not want to examine. I kissed him back, and it felt like falling and flying at the same time, my hands fisting in his torn shirt to pull him closer, even as some distant part of my brain screamed that this was wrong on every possible level. He tasted like adrenaline and smoke, and something darker, something that should have frightened me, but instead made me press closer until there was no space left between us at all. His arm wrapped around my waist, pulling me flush against him, and I could feel the tension in his body, the barely leashed control that I was somehow unraveling just by being here, by kissing him back like I needed this as much as he did. When we finally broke apart, we were both breathing hard, his forehead pressed against mine, his hand still cradling my face, like I was something precious, instead of a prisoner he was protecting from his enemies. "This is insane," I managed to say, the words coming out shaky and uncertain. "Yes," he agreed, his voice rougher than I had ever heard it. And then he was kissing me again, deeper this time, more thorough, like he was trying to memorize the taste of me, or maybe trying to prove something neither of us wanted to admit. The monitors behind us showed the estate in ruins, fires still burning in some sections, his men moving through the grounds checking for remaining threats. The world outside still dangerous and chaotic and wrong, but in this concrete room sealed away from everything, pressed against this strikingly handsome man in his late 20s who had just fought a small war to keep me safe. None of that seemed to matter. His hands were gentle as they moved through my hair, and mine had found their way under his ruined shirt to feel the warmth of his skin and the rapid beating of his heart. And somewhere between one breath and the next, I stopped pretending this was anything other than what it was. Stopped fighting against the inevitability that had been building since the moment he had appeared in my doorway with a gun in his hand and determination in his eyes. We had crossed a line and there was no going back. We had not slept together, not fully, but we had stayed in each other's arms on the concrete floor of the panic room until dawn broke across the monitors and the estate outside went quiet with the kind of silence that follows violence. His back was against the wall, and I was curled against his chest, listening to the steady rhythm of his heartbeat. And somewhere in those hours, the terror had faded into something else, something I did not have words for and was not ready to examine. When pale light started filtering through the edges of the sealed door, he stirred, and I felt the change in him immediately, the way his body tensed and his breathing shifted from the deep steadiness of near sleep to the controlled awareness of a man remembering who and what he was. I sat up and he let me go without protest, his protective walls sliding back into place so smoothly I might have imagined the vulnerability of the night before, except I could still feel the ghost of his hands in my hair and taste him on my lips. We did not speak as he helped me to my feet, did not look at each other as he checked the monitors one final time before unsealing the door, and the silence between us was different now, heavy with things neither of us knew how to say. The house beyond the panic room was a disaster, broken glass and bullet holes and scorch marks on walls that had been pristine yesterday, and his men were everywhere cleaning and repairing and removing evidence of the attack with efficient precision. He walked me back to my room and stopped at the door, finally meeting my eyes, and I saw the strikingly handsome man in his late 20s who had kissed me like he was drowning, and I was air-warring with the crime boss who held me prisoner and could not afford weakness. "I do not know what this is," I said, the words escaping before I could stop them, needing to voice the confusion that was tearing me apart from the inside. "Neither do I," he admitted, and something in his honesty made my chest ache. "But I know I will not let anyone harm you." I reached out and placed my hand on his chest, feeling his heart beating fast beneath my palm despite his controlled exterior. "That is not what I am afraid of anymore," I said, and watched understanding dawn in his dark eyes. The admission hung between us like a confession, the truth that somewhere in the past week I had stopped being afraid of what he might do to me, and started being afraid of what I might feel for him, of how easily my hatred had transformed into something infinitely more dangerous. He covered my hand with his own, his touch warm and solid and real, and for a moment I thought he might kiss me again, might pull me into his arms and make me forget all the reasons this was impossible. Instead, he stepped back, his expression shuddering. "Get some rest," he said, his voice carefully neutral. "We will talk later." But as I watched him walk away down the damaged hallway, I knew that talking would not change what had already shifted between us in that concrete room while the world burned outside. I was allowed to shower and change into clean clothes, but not to rest, because within an hour there was a knock on my door and one of his men told me Dante required my presence in his office immediately, and the formality of the summons made my stomach clench with dread. The office looked different in the harsh morning light streaming through windows that had somehow survived the attack, less like a businessman's domain and more like a war room with maps spread across his desk and photographs of men I did not recognize pinned to boards that had been wheeled in overnight. Dante stood behind his desk with another man, older and harder looking, who I had seen occasionally in the hallways but never spoken to. "This is Luca," Dante said without preamble, his voice carrying a cold fury I had not heard before. "My second in command. Tell her." Luca's eyes flicked to me with something that might have been sympathy before he started speaking in accented English that was rougher than Dante's. "The attack last night was ordered by the Bratva, the Russian organization that has been trying to move into our territory for the past 2 years. They know about you, Miss Chen. They know you witnessed the interrogation of their men. They want the witness, and they are willing to start a war to get her." The words hit me like physical blows, and I gripped the back of a chair to keep from swaying. "They will trade her for territory access," Luca continued, pointing to the maps on the desk. "They believe we will give her up to avoid a larger conflict. They believe she is expendable." Dante's hand came down on the desk with enough force to make me jump, his eyes blazing with something dark and dangerous. "They cannot have her," he said, and the possessiveness in his voice was absolute, allowing no room for argument or negotiation. The strikingly handsome man in his late 20s, who had held me in a panic room and kissed me like I was oxygen, looked like he could burn the world down without a second thought, and I realized with sickening clarity that this was the man his enemies feared. This was the violence barely contained beneath expensive suits and careful control. Luca nodded like he had expected this response. "Then we prepare for war. They sent 20 men last night as a test. Next time it will be 200. I felt the blood drain from my face as the full scope of the danger crashed over me. People were going to die because I had walked into the wrong room. A war was going to start because I existed, and the only thing standing between me and the Bratva, who wanted to torture me for information and leverage, was this man who had kissed me hours ago and was now looking at maps like he was planning a massacre. His protection was not just control anymore, it was survival, mine and apparently his. He summoned me to his bedroom that evening, a space I had never entered before, and the intimacy of the location made my pulse quicken even before I understood why he had brought me there. The room was masculine and spare, with dark, wood furniture and floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the damaged gardens, and he stood with his back to me, looking out at the destruction the Bratva had caused while I waited by the door not knowing what was coming. "I can get you out," he said without turning around, his voice carefully controlled in a way that made me think the control was costing him something. "New identity for you and Dylan. Protection in another country where the Bratva cannot reach. Enough money that you will never have to worry about his medical bills or anything else. You would be safe." The offer should have filled me with relief, should have been everything I wanted since the moment I had walked into that concrete room and seen things I could never unsee. But instead, I felt something cold and hollow opening in my chest. "I would never see you again," I said, and the words came out smaller than I intended. He turned then, and the look on the face of this strikingly handsome man in his late 20s was something I had never seen before, raw and unguarded in a way that made my breath catch. "I can protect you best by sending you away," he said, moving closer but stopping just out of reach like he did not trust himself to get too close. "It is the smart choice, Maya, the only choice that keeps you alive without starting a war that will kill hundreds of people." His logic was sound and we both knew it, but I could not make myself agree, could not make myself accept this escape he was offering, even though it was everything rational and sane. And if I do not want the smart choice? I asked, taking a step toward him and watching his jaw tighten with tension. What if I want to stay? His hands clenched into fists at his sides and something flashed in his dark eyes that looked like pain or longing, or both tangled together. Do not ask me to be selfish with your life, he said, his voice rough. Do not ask me to keep you here in danger, because I cannot bear to let you go. The admission hung between us like a grenade, with the pin pulled, and I understood suddenly that this offer was not just about my safety, but about his own struggle between what he wanted and what was right. He was giving me the choice he had promised, the freedom to walk away, and it was clearly destroying him to do it. I closed the distance between us until I was close enough to feel the heat radiating from his body, close enough to see the war being fought behind his eyes. What if I choose you? I whispered, and watched him close his eyes, like I had just delivered a mortal wound. He opened his eyes, and the look in them made my heart stutter, because I had never seen him this unguarded, this exposed, like every wall he had spent years building was crumbling, and he was too tired to hold them up anymore. My father was killed by the Bratva, he said, his voice low and rough with old pain. 15 years ago they put a bullet in his head because he would not give them territory they wanted, and I was 19 years old when I inherited an empire built on blood and a vendetta I did not ask for but could not refuse. His hands came up to frame my face with a gentleness that seemed impossible from someone capable of such violence. I have spent 15 years making myself untouchable, he continued, his thumbs tracing my cheekbones like he was memorizing the shape of them. Caring about nothing and no one, because caring is weakness in my world and weakness gets you killed. I built walls so high that nothing could reach me, made myself into something cold and efficient and powerful. And I told myself that was enough, that revenge and control were enough. Then you walked into the wrong room. The memory of that night flashed between us, the concrete floor and the bound men and the gun in his hand, and I saw myself through his eyes for the first time, saw the way I had looked at him, not with the fear he was used to, but with something else. You looked at me like I was a monster, he said, and there was wonder in his voice like he still could not quite believe it. Not with fear, but with disappointment, as if you expected better from me, as if you thought I should be better. No one has looked at me like that since my father died. No one has made me want to be anything other than what I am. His forehead touched mine, and I could feel him trembling. This strikingly handsome man in his late 20s, who commanded armies and inspired terror, showing me a vulnerability I suspected few people ever witnessed. You make me want to be better, Maya, he whispered against my lips. You make me want to be the man you thought I could be when you looked at me with those disappointed eyes. You are my weakness, and that should terrify me, but instead it makes me feel alive for the first time in 15 years. I understood then what it cost him to admit this, understood that in his world, love was not romance or security, but danger and liability, something that could be used against you by enemies who would exploit any crack in your armor. He was confessing not just his feelings but his vulnerability, admitting that I had become the thing that could destroy him more completely than any bullet or betrayal. And he was doing it anyway, laying himself bare in this intimate space, while offering me freedom with one hand even as his heart begged me to stay with the other. I pulled back just enough to look into his eyes, and felt something settle in my chest. A certainty that cut through all the confusion and fear and rational objections that should have been screaming at me to take the escape he was offering. I do not want to leave, I said, and watched something flicker across his face that might have been hope struggling against disbelief. I see who you are, Dante, all of it. The violence and the empire and the danger and the blood on your hands that will never wash clean. I see the man who tortured those men in that concrete room, and the man who paid my brother's medical bills, and the man who kissed me in a panic room while the world burned outside. I see all of it, and I am choosing you anyway. His breath caught and his hands tightened on my face, like he was afraid I might disappear if he let go. Like he could not quite believe what he was hearing from this woman he had essentially held prisoner for a week. I spent 3 years keeping Dylan alive, I continued, my own hands coming up to cover his. 3 years keeping us afloat and being strong every single day because I had to be. Because there was no one else, and failure meant losing the only family I had left. I am so tired of just surviving, Dante, of going through the motions and pretending that existing is the same as living. With you, even in danger, even knowing what you are and what you do, I feel alive. I kissed him then, soft and deliberate. Not the desperate collision of last night, but a choice made with clear eyes and full knowledge of what it meant. When I pulled back, I saw this strikingly handsome man in his late 20s looking at me like I was something precious and terrifying at the same time. Like he wanted to believe me, but was afraid of what it would cost us both. I am not going anywhere, I said, deliberately echoing his words from that first night when he had blocked my escape and told me I was his, reclaiming the phrase and transforming it from a threat into a promise. Not because you are making me stay, and not because I am afraid of what is out there. I am staying because I choose this, because I choose you, because somehow in the middle of this impossible situation, I found something I did not even know I was looking for. His control finally broke and he pulled me against him hard enough that I felt it in my ribs. His face buried in my hair, his whole body trembling with emotion he had probably not allowed himself to feel in 15 years. I wrapped my arms around him and held on just as tightly. Two people who had been surviving alone, finding something like salvation in each other, despite all the reasons it should have been impossible, and I knew with absolute certainty that I had just made a choice that would change everything. When he lifted me into his arms and carried me to the bed, I did not protest or hesitate, because this was not about force or control, but about two people who had been fighting against the inevitable finally surrendering to it, and as he laid me down on sheets that smelled like cedar and smoke, I saw in his eyes everything he had confessed, and everything he had not said. The fireplace across the room cast dancing shadows that turned his face into planes of light and darkness as he followed me down, his weight settling over me with a reverence that made my breath catch, because this strikingly handsome man in his late 20s, who commanded empires and inspired fear, was looking at me like I was something sacred. His hands moved over me with a gentleness that contradicted everything I knew about what those hands could do, tracing the shape of my body like he, memorizing every curve and hollow. And when I reached for him, he caught my wrists and pinned them gently above my head with one hand, while the other continued its exploration. "You are mine," he whispered against my throat, and the words should have frightened me, but instead they sent heat spiraling through my body. "Say it." The command was soft but absolute, and I found myself answering without hesitation. "I am yours." The truth of it settled over me like a brand, and I understood that this was not just physical but something deeper, a claiming that went beyond bodies to something more fundamental. "Yes," he breathed. And then there were no more words, just sensation and need and the feeling of barriers that had been crumbling for days finally collapsing completely. He moved against me, and I moved with him, our bodies finding a rhythm that felt inevitable, like this had always been where we were heading from the moment I had walked into that wrong room and our lives had collided. The world outside ceased to exist, the danger and the enemies and the impossibility of what we were doing all fading until there was nothing but firelight, and the sound of our breathing and the feeling of skin against skin. I had spent 3 years being strong and controlled and responsible, had built my own walls to survive the weight of caring for Dylan alone. And in his arms, those walls shattered into something that felt like freedom, even though I knew it was the opposite of freedom by any rational definition. This was surrender, and trust, and choosing each other despite every logical reason not to. And when he whispered my name like a prayer, I answered with his, our voices tangling together in the darkness, while the fire burned low and the estate stood silent around us, damaged but standing, just like we were. Morning came too soon, and with it the return of reality, the world intruding on what we had built in the darkness with its demands and dangers, and the unavoidable fact that the Bratva still wanted me, and would not stop until they had me or were destroyed. Dante was already awake when I opened my eyes, propped on one elbow watching me with an expression that was part tenderness and part something harder, more calculating, and I knew before he spoke that he had been planning while I slept. "I am not sending you away," he said, his fingers tracing idle patterns on my shoulder that contradicted the intensity in his voice. "I am going to end this threat permanently so you never have to run or hide or look over your shoulder again." The coldly strategic tone told me he had already worked out the details, had already calculated risks and acceptable losses the way generals planned battles, but beneath it, I could hear something else, a thread of fear he was trying to hide. "Use me to draw them out," I said, the idea forming even as I spoke it. "They want the witness, so give them a chance at the witness, and when they come for me, you take them all." His eyes darkened with something that might have been pride or might have been terror. "I will have 200 men on you," he said. "Every angle covered, every approach monitored. They will never get close enough to touch you." But the way he said it made me think he was trying to convince himself as much as me. We moved to his office where Luca was already waiting with maps and surveillance photos. And when Dante explained the plan, I watched the older man's face darken with concern. "This is too risky," Luca said, his accent thickening with agitation. "You are betting everything on your ability to protect her in a public space with multiple access points. One mistake, and they take her and we lose everything." "She is right," Dante cut him off, his voice carrying absolute authority. "It ends now, one way or another. I will not spend the rest of my life waiting for them to make their move, and I will not send her away to live in hiding because I am too afraid to face this threat directly." The plan crystallized as they talked, a charity gala at a luxury hotel in 3 days, where I would appear publicly for the first time as the woman of this strikingly handsome man in his late 20s, who ran an empire, visible and vulnerable and irresistible bait for an organization that wanted me badly enough to start a war. Every detail was calculated, from the placement of his men throughout the hotel to the security checkpoints disguised as normal gala procedures to the extraction routes if something went wrong. I sat listening to them plan my near abduction like it was a business transaction, and felt strangely calm, because for the first time since this started, I was not a passive victim or a helpless prisoner, but an active participant in ending the threat that had defined my existence for the past week. The gown they brought me was midnight blue silk that clung to my body like water and probably cost more than I used to make in a year. And when I looked at myself in the mirror, I barely recognized the woman staring back, elegant and composed and ready to be bait in a trap that could get me killed. Dante was waiting at the bottom of the stairs in a tuxedo that made him look like he had stepped out of a magazine, this strikingly handsome man in his late 20s who was about to use me to lure his enemies into the open. And when his eyes traveled over me, I saw hunger and possession and fear, all tangled together. The hotel ballroom was everything I had imagined from another life. Crystal chandeliers casting rainbow light across marble floors and tables draped in white linen, where the wealthy and powerful gathered, pretending they did not know exactly what kind of man was hosting this event. His hand never left the small of my back as we moved through the crowd, his possessive attention so obvious that anyone watching would know exactly what I was to him. And I could feel eyes tracking us from every corner of the room, some curious and some calculating, and some that made my skin crawl with their intensity. I had been at the gala for 40 minutes, had smiled and made small talk, and played my role perfectly when I felt Dante tense beside me, his hand tightening on my waist in a way that told me something was happening. The first shot shattered a champagne flute 3 tables away, and then everything exploded into chaos. People screaming and diving for cover, while men in suits I had never seen before pulled weapons and advanced toward us from 3 different directions. Dante moved faster than I thought possible, his body covering mine as he pulled me down behind an overturned table, and around us, his men materialized from positions I had not known they were holding, cutting off the Bratva assassins with a precision that spoke of hours of planning. The gunfire was deafening in the enclosed space, chandeliers shattering and raining crystal like deadly snow, blood appearing on the pristine marble in dark splashes that looked black in the chaos of emergency lighting that had replaced the elegant glow. "I have got you," Dante said against my ear, his body a shield between me and the violence erupting around us. "I will always have you." I should have been terrified, should have been paralyzed with fear as bullets tore through the space where I had been standing moments before, but instead, I felt strangely calm because I trusted this man with my life in a way I had never trusted anyone. "I know," I said, and meant it with every fiber of my being. The fight was over in less than 3 minutes, Dante's men overwhelming the Bratva assassins with overwhelming force and tactical superiority, and when he finally lifted his head to assess the damage, I saw something fierce and triumphant in his expression, because the trap had worked, and the threat was ended, and I was alive and whole in his arms. 3 days after the gala, the news broke that key members of the Bratva leadership had been arrested in coordinated raids across the city, and the ones who were not in custody were dead or had fled the country. Their organization dismantled so thoroughly it would take decades to rebuild if it ever did at all. Dante had used the attack at the gala as justification to move against them with every resource at his disposal, legal and otherwise, and the fallout had strengthened his position in ways I was only beginning to understand as men came to the house to pay respects and negotiate territories that had suddenly become available. I was no longer a secret or a prisoner, but something else entirely. The woman who stood beside this strikingly handsome man in his late 20s when business was conducted, whose opinion he sometimes asked, and whose presence seemed to signal something important about alliances and trust. The mansion felt different now, less like a gilded cage and more like home, and I had stopped counting the days until I could leave, because I no longer wanted to leave. Dylan came to visit on a Saturday afternoon, brought in one of Dante's armored cars with enough security to protect a head of state, and when I met him at the door, his eyes went wide, taking in the estate and the obvious wealth and the way Dante's hand rested casually on my lower back, like it belonged there. We walked in the garden while Dante gave us privacy, though I knew his men were watching from discreet distances, and Dylan was quiet for a long time, before he finally asked the question I had been dreading. "Are you sure you are okay?" he said, his 14-year-old face trying so hard to look mature and protective. "I have been reading things online about him and his family and what they do." I stopped walking and turned to face my brother, this boy I had raised and sacrificed everything for, and I needed him to understand that this was real and right, even if it looked wrong from the outside. "I am better than okay," I said, taking his hands in mine. "I am exactly where I choose to be Dylan. He did terrible things to keep me safe, and he will probably do terrible things again, because that is his world. But he also paid your medical bills, and protected us both, and made me feel like I matter for the first time since Mom and Dad died. I know it does not make sense, and I know it is not what I planned for my life, but neither was raising you at 23, and I have never regretted that choice." Dylan studied my face for a long moment, and then hugged me fiercely. "You look happy," he said into my shoulder. "Really happy. Not the fake happy you have been doing for 3 years. That is all I care about." When Dante joined us later, I saw them size each other up, the crime boss and the teenage boy, and something passed between them that looked like understanding, or maybe respect, and I knew that my two worlds had just collided and somehow held together. 2 weeks later, I found myself in his office going over the guest list for another charity event. This one, legitimately charitable rather than an elaborate trap. And through the open door, I saw a new maid cleaning the hallway with the same nervous energy I had brought to this house what felt like a lifetime ago, but was barely a month. She jumped every time someone walked past, kept her head down, moved with the careful precision of someone trying desperately not to make mistakes, and I recognized myself so completely in her fear that it made my chest ache. I had been her, arriving with a second-hand duffel bag and desperation sharp enough to ignore every warning sign, willing to overlook red flags because I needed the money badly enough to pretend I did not see the danger. Now I stood in designer clothes in the office of a strikingly handsome man in his late 20s who had held me prisoner and then set me free by making me want to stay. And the distance between who I had been and who I had become felt infinite and impossibly small at the same time. I felt him before I heard him, his presence filling the doorway as he watched me watching the girl. And when his arms came around my waist from behind, I leaned into him without hesitation, letting his warmth seep into my back and his chin rest on my shoulder. "Regrets?" he asked quietly, the single word carrying the weight of everything we had been through, the violence and fear and impossible choices that had brought us to this moment. "Not a single one," I said, and meant it with a certainty that still surprised me sometimes when I examined it too closely. He turned me in his arms until I was facing him, his hands framing my face with that same gentleness that never failed to undo me, and his eyes held mine with an intensity that made my breath catch. "Good," he said, his thumb tracing my lower lip. "Because you are not going anywhere." The words that had terrified me that first night, when he had blocked my escape, now settled over me like a benediction, and I smiled up at him, feeling lighter than I had in years. "I know," I said, rising on my toes to kiss him softly. "I am exactly where I want to be." The office around us held ghosts of who we had been, the captor and the captive, the crime boss and the desperate woman who had walked into the wrong room and seen too much. But those people felt like strangers now. We had become something else through fire and blood and choices that should have destroyed us, but instead had forged us into something stronger than either of us had been alone. The new maid in the hallway would probably never know that the woman she saw in expensive clothes had once been just like her, scared and desperate and willing to overlook danger for survival. She would never know that the strikingly handsome man in his late 20s who owned this estate had once held that woman prisoner, and that woman had chosen him anyway, had looked at the monster and seen the man and decided that was enough. Some stories were too complicated to tell, too impossible to believe, too dangerous to share. This was ours, built on ashes and blood money and a love that should not exist, but did anyway. Fierce and real and mine.